Hi, everyone. We are pleased to share with you part 2 of our event series, Deadlock in Israel-Palestine, How to Imagine a Better Future, co-hosted by the USC Casden Institute and the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. This event took place on December 5th, 2021, and part 1 took place on October 3rd, 2021. If you're curious, you can sign up for part 3, the final installment of the series, which will take place on March 6th of this year. You can sign up by going to tinyurl.com/deadlock-part3. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Ross, director of the USC Casden Institute and Dean's Professor of History at USC. And on behalf of the Casden Institute and our partners at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy and the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to today's discussion. Our event today is the second of a multi-part series that focuses on the theme of deadlock in Israel-Palestine, how to imagine a better future. And our panels feature leading scholars, thinkers, and policymakers, all of whom have different visions to reflect on the current impasse in Israel-Palestine and to share proposals for the future. We will also have a third panel sometime this spring. But for far too long, the gap between the one and two state solutions has prevented a long overdue discussion of how to reimagine the conversation between the two nations, both of whom have legitimate roots and claim to the same land. It is our hope to shed light rather than heat on a topic that's generally avoided due to its polarizing nature. But we hope as a university, or as our two universities, in conjunction with a number of other scholars, we hope to pioneer a new dialogue on how to deliver justice, equality, and peace to all inhabitants of the region. If we can't start a discussion, who can? At this point, I would like to welcome my colleague and today's moderator, David Myers. David is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History and the director of the Ludwig Center for History and Policy. He previously served as chair of the UCLA History Department and director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies. And David has written extensively in the fields of modern Jewish history, amongst his many publications, reinventing the Jewish past, European Jewish intellectuals, and the Zionist return to history, Between Jew and Arab, the lost voice of Simon Radovich, Jewish History, a very short introduction, and his forthcoming book written with Nomi Stolzenberg called American Shtetl, The Making of Kiryas Joel, a Hasidic Village in upstate New York. In addition to his position at UCLA, David has taught at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris and the Russian State University for the Humanities. He's also been a 3-time fellow at the Katz Center for Advanced Studies, Judaic Studies in Philadelphia. And most importantly at all, I want to acknowledge that David has been the brains behind our various panels dealing with reimagining the Israel-Palestine relationship. It's my great pleasure to introduce David, who in turn introduce today's panelists. David.
Thank you, Steve, for that really warm introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be with you, and good morning to our audience, good afternoon, good evening to our Zoom audience that spans a 10-hour difference from Los Angeles to Tel Aviv. On behalf of the Luskin and Nazarian Centers at UCLA and my colleagues Maya Ferdman and Professor Dov Waxman, we're delighted to join together with the Casden Institute to sponsor this program. As Steve said, this is the second event in our series that not only brings together a diverse group of thinkers to reflect on the future, it also brings together two crosstown rivals, USC and UCLA, in a common quest for knowledge. What we're trying to model consciously and in our own modest way is how to marshal our shared intellectual resources to effect positive change. With respect to the situation in Israel-Palestine, it seemed to us that what was most urgent was the need to stimulate thinking about the future in the face of stasis on the ground. So there are currently no peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. This means there's no movement on the long regnant model of the two-state solution, which has dominated diplomatic conversations for decades. A key question remains whether the two-state solution is even viable, about which we may hear different views today. As an alternative, some put forward various formulations of a one-state solution, but it too elicits widely divergent views of its possibility and even desirability. Those of you who were with us at our first session on October 3rd may remember that two of our speakers, Omar Rahman and Dalia Schindlin, spoke of a third model, the Confederation model, premised on two states, open borders, and a governmental entity shared by the two states. One of our speakers today, Dr. Micah Goodman, speaks of a far more modest plan of action, not solving the conflict, but shrinking it, which requires recalibrating expectations and ambitions. What might that look like? Well, we'll have an opportunity to hear today. All of our speakers will have the opportunity to present their own distinct visions. As it happens, 3 of them are Israeli citizens, 2 Jews and 1 Palestinian. In our next forum, planned, we hope, for March 2022, the balance will likely be different, though the main task is to hear from interesting and smart thinkers who can help propel us from a state of theoretical poverty to a richly imaginative world of possibility. We don't imagine that ideas alone can be engines of change, or the sole engines of change, but at the same time, we know that change cannot be possible without the power of ideas. So this is our mandate, to think beyond the present state of affairs, marked by indifference in one case and despair in another, to frameworks that enable the values of justice, equality, and security to be realized. I should add that as an historian, I'd like to think that recourse to the past might well be a source of inspiration. Whether that be so or not, we must be bold enough to think with open-mindedness and courage about the future. So again, think of this series as a laboratory to present and try out new ideas in a spirit of constructive criticism. In a minute, I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists briefly. Each of them will have up to 10 minutes to assess where we are and, most importantly, where we should be going by laying out a vision of the future. After the 4 have completed their remarks, we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves, the panelists and myself, and we will then move to Q&A. I invite you in the audience to send along your questions by using the Q&A function, and we very much look forward to your input. So let's begin. I'll introduce all of our speakers now in alphabetical order, which will be the same order in which they'll speak. So our first presenter is Dr. Julie Cooper, who teaches political theory at Tel Aviv University. Julie is currently at work on a fascinating project that examines the history, theoretical foundations, and future prospects of diaspora autonomism, an alternative to state-based sovereignty that's most associated with a Russian Jewish historian from the early 20th century, Shimon Dubnov. Our next speaker is Dr. Micah Goodman, who is a philosopher and the author of a string of best-selling books in Israel on topics ranging from the biblical Moses to the medieval Maimonides to contemporary politics, as in his book Catch 67. I should note that there was a long article on Micah in this past week's Haaretz, whose title was "The Most Influential Intellectual on the Israeli Government." Who are you, Micah Goodman? And so we're soon to find out. Our next speaker is Dr. Hussein Ibish, who is really one of the smartest and most informed observers of the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the United States. Hussein is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington and author of a steady stream of commentaries for Bloomberg and The National, among other outlets. And our final speaker is Dr. Areej Sabbagh-Khoury, who teaches in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Areej is one of the most interesting and prominent junior scholars working on the impact of Zionism and the Israeli state on Palestinians from 1948 to the present. I'm proud to call all four of our speakers not only friends, but deeply original scholars and thinkers. Welcome to all four of our panelists, and thank you all in the audience for joining us on a day when USC and UCLA join together in collaboration. And I'd now like to turn to our first presenter, Dr. Julie Cooper.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. So my point of departure in my remarks today is the observation that the conflict is no longer the defining issue in Israeli politics. Arguably, it's no longer even a salient issue in Israeli politics. Israeli leaders are not committed to resume the peace process, nor does the US administration appear inclined to put pressure on any of the parties involved, given the very slim likelihood that such pressure would yield results. More important, I think, the Israeli Jewish public is largely disengaged from and indifferent to what goes on in the occupied territories and betrays no eagerness to revive the peace process. As the recent interminable election cycle attests, the conflict no longer defines the major ideological cleavages in Israeli politics. Among Israeli Jews, the main ideological debates arguably turn on issues such as the Supreme Court, the separation of powers, and the informal norms that we call mamlachtiyut in Hebrew. The apparent vitriol of Israeli political discourse notwithstanding, there's actually a profound consensus between right and left when it comes to the conflict. Neither camp evinces much faith in the possibility or the desirability of arriving at a negotiated settlement. Most Jewish Israelis are located somewhere on the spectrum, a rather narrow spectrum, between conflict management and conflict reduction. Only the increasingly marginal remnants of the left still speak of conflict resolution. Given this context, one could ask, what is the point of debating alternative solutions? In the absence of a public commitment to a negotiated settlement, in the absence of a constituency for any kind of peace process, why debate the merits of a 1 or 2 or 3 state solution? As I'll explain in a minute, I do think that there is a point in debating these questions, provided that we do so in a way that is responsive to the current political landscape. Too often, Israeli Jewish leftists, and when I talk about Israeli Jewish leftists, I mean people who are committed to a negotiated settlement which is egalitarian. Too often, Israeli Jews who are in this camp conduct debates about alternatives in a way that is disconnected from these daunting political realities. And so I'll give you one example of the sometimes disconnected tone of these debates. On October 21st this year, two scholars, Menny Mautner and Yoel Zinger, published an article in Haaretz defending a confederal solution to the conflict. Their article sparked a heated debate, yielding, at my count, 10 articles published in response in the pages of Haaretz. In these 10 articles, partisans and opponents of the confederal solution debated the fine points of a final status agreement up to and including the shared aquifer. Yet in this contentious back and forth, few paused to imagine ways to build public enthusiasm for any of the proposals debated. Indeed, in their original article, Mautner and Zinger acknowledged that a confederal solution is unlikely to convince either of the critical constituencies, that is, Israelis and Palestinians. As this example demonstrates, among Jewish liberals and leftists, the conversation has devolved from a robustly political debate, that is, a debate that used to be about mass political mobilization. It has devolved from that kind of political debate into a debate about technicalities. The tenor of these debates, in which the conflict is essentially reduced to a technical problem, is a symptom, I would argue, of the left's political exhaustion. Thus, the first order of business, I would argue, is to repoliticize the debate on alternatives to the two-state solution. The imperative now is not to solve technical problems or draw up ever more precise maps and blueprints. Rather, the goal of the discourse surrounding alternative solutions must be to inspire political mobilization and facilitate the creation of new and unexpected political coalitions. So here, of course, I'm going to have to insert the requisite caveat that I'm not a politician and I don't presume to know what might inspire mass political mobilization in favor of a negotiated settlement. But within the limits of my competence as a political theorist, I would like to propose two ways in which we can repoliticize the discourse surrounding alternatives to the two-state solution. First, debating alternatives can show people that such alternatives exist. In the wake of Oslo's failure, most Israelis appear to have concluded that the death of the two-state solution consigns us to some form of conflict management. And Micah Goodman is an exponent of the view that the aspiration to a final status agreement is, in some sense, misguided. In this political climate, I would argue, the primary aim of the debate surrounding alternatives is to challenge the consensus position against conflict resolution. In sum, the demise of the two-state solution need not signal the demise of the aspiration toward an egalitarian and democratic negotiated settlement. Second, if done properly, the debate surrounding alternatives could inspire renewed political imagination, providing a vivid theoretical language in which to articulate the twin aspirations to democracy and national self-determination. Toward that end, I want to very briefly explore one possible reframing of the debate. In particular, I want to explore the political possibilities that might emerge if we adopt a theoretical framework that I call autonomism. As David mentioned, the term autonomism has a rich historical legacy within the annals of Jewish thought. The term is usually associated with the historian and political activist Shimon Dubnov, who was a proponent of diaspora nationalism and advocated national minority rights for Jews in Eastern Europe. Although mindful of this history, I'm more drawn to the term because of its contemporary political resonance. In recent years, artists, journalists, and cultural critics have started using the term autonomy to describe what they see as the increasing fragmentation of Israeli society. For example, in the wake of violations of lockdown regulations in the early days of the pandemic, the term Haredi autonomy gained currency to describe a supposedly lawless enclave within the state's borders, but refusing to recognize its sovereignty. Recent events have led many to conclude that Israel has devolved from a fully functioning sovereign state into a loose and ungovernable patchwork of autonomies. For most pundits, the rise of autonomous enclaves signals a full-fledged crisis, heralding a dystopian future. Yet I want to suggest that adopting autonomous frameworks could help us to envision a non-dystopian and democratic future for Israel-Palestine. As the term's increasing popular currency suggests, autonomous thinking dovetails with sociological and political realities emerging on the ground. Can we exploit these centrifugal dynamics to envision a democratic alternative to partitioning the region into two sovereign nation states? As a political language, autonomism differs from the liberal frameworks through which Israeli Jewish leftists have traditionally analyzed the conflict. Autonomism is different from liberalism in two ways. First, it detaches political membership from territory. Drawing on historical examples from multinational states, autonomists reject territorial definitions of the polity. From an autonomous perspective, it is entirely possible that neighboring households will belong to different nationalities and vote in different assemblies. Second, autonomists deny that majority status is necessary for national self-determination. Uncoupling national membership from territorial concentration does not only accommodate national diversity within a single jurisdiction, it also recasts the political valence of minority status. Drawing on precedents from Jewish history, Dubnov contends that, given the right legal and political institutions, minorities can exercise meaningful self-rule. Instead of carving the region into discrete units such that each nationality constitutes a majority somewhere, autonomists would design innovative legal and political institutions to facilitate national self-determination without territorial partition. In sum, autonomous political thought dispenses with the aspiration to majority standing, territorial concentration, and cultural hegemony. An autonomist approach to multinational democracy advocates a layered model of citizenship in which citizens simultaneously profess formal allegiance to their national community and to the umbrella polity, which accords equal standing to all nationalities, irrespective of majority standing. There is no ruling nationality in an autonomous regime. In other words, autonomism seeks to ensure democratic equality without demanding that citizens renounce aspirations to national self-determination. What would this mean in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? An autonomous vision could provide the normative and theoretical infrastructure for initiatives such as two states, one homeland, or arguably also for confederal solutions, initiatives which extend national self-determination to Jews and Palestinians without resorting to territorial partition. But again, my aim today has not been to draft a map or a blueprint, but rather to suggest a potentially fruitful theoretical reframing. Autonomism offers an alternative normative language that indicates radically new ways to reconcile commitments to democracy, equality, and national self-determination. My hunch here is that the left can only revitalize its political energy and imagination by playing the long game, that is, cultivating a compelling democratic language that allows us to reframe the conflict in ways that might yield hitherto unimagined political programs and coalitions. And I'll just conclude by saying that the autonomism I'm envisioning here is an egalitarian and democratic autonomism, and therefore it is different from the autonomism of the right that people since Begin have advocated, because I'm not advocating a state for Jews and an autonomy for Palestinians. I'm arguing for a vision in which autonomy is a solution for all, and the national self-determination of both Jews and Palestinians finds expression at the local level. So in that sense, a democratic autonomous regime would require the devolution of Jewish sovereignty so as to establish Jewish and Palestinian self-determination on an equal footing. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. You've really gotten us off to a good start by proposing very concretely an alternative theoretical language, which nonetheless raises many questions, which I hope we get to take up, and I certainly plan to do so. But without further ado, I want to turn now to Micah Goodman.
Thank you, Julie, very much. That was very thought-provoking, and I want to hear more about your very creative idea. I want to start with what Julie began with, that Israelis are extremely indifferent towards the conflict. And the reasons for Israeli indifference are many. But Israelis used to be very passionate regarding the conflict. And they believed there was an exciting vision, a charismatic vision of peace through a two-state solution. And most Israelis, after 1993 and after Oslo, started believing in that. And for many reasons, we won't go into the blame game now. After the second Intifada, most Israelis lost their trust. They didn't believe this was possible. And then Israelis, and when I say Israelis, I'm an Israeli, so I'll use the word we. When we stopped believing that peace is possible, we went into a process that led to indifference. But that is a very problematic and distorted process. Because if you think that you can't end the conflict and solve a problem, the reaction to that shouldn't be indifference. But for many reasons, that's what happened to many Israelis. And we're trapped in a false dichotomy. And it's the following dichotomy. There are people on the left that still believe that it might be possible to solve the conflict, to end the conflict, to solve this problem, this historic problem. But then the alternative is, well, if we can't solve this problem, let's just not do anything about it. And there's different ways of ignoring the problem. And the whole Netanyahu paradigm was managing the conflict, keeping things the way they are, more or less freezing the status quo and containing it. Now, if you think about it, this is obviously a very false dichotomy. We don't think about any problems or any issues in that way, where if you can't solve it, you ignore it. We don't think about COVID that way, right? I think New Zealand and Australia in the very beginning, they wanted to solve COVID, no COVID, zero COVID. It didn't really work for them. But other governments didn't say, well, if we can't solve it, we'll ignore it. They want to somehow shrink the size of COVID to a size that could be bearable and lived with. That's how we think about crime. Most people don't say, let's end crime. And the alternative to ending crime is not ignoring crime. We try to shrink the amount of crime. Say car accidents. I don't want to live in a country where people want to end car accidents, because the measures the government will use will be very dangerous measures. And yet, if you can't end car accidents, that doesn't mean we're ignoring it. Smart policies try to shrink the amount of car accidents. So I think our political language is somehow, I'm talking as an Israeli, the Israeli political language is somehow suffering from some kind of poverty, where we're trapped in a false dichotomy. Either you end the conflict or you ignore the conflict. And since most Israelis believe that we can't end the conflict, so the alternative is just ignoring it and doing nothing about it. And I think we need a new idea. And the new idea is not a very exciting idea. It's not as original as Julie Cooper. It's not like reframing everything. It's just about thinking about this problem like we think about any other problem. We can't solve it. We're not going to ignore it. We should shrink it. Let me just try to explain what does it mean to shrink the conflict. It means looking at the situation, not in an ideal world, but the situation as it is today on the ground. And on the ground today, Palestinians are enjoying a certain level of self-governance. certain level of autonomy. Now, the only way for that autonomy to turn into a full-fledged state is through negotiations and peace and signing that document of recognizing Israel. All these things that seem right now impossible to achieve. And Israelis would not, almost all Israelis would not want to create an independent Palestinian state without a peace treaty with Israel, with that end of conflict, because there's a lot of security risks involved there, according to many Israelis, me myself included. So here's the thing. Right now, the level of autonomy created in Oslo in 1993 is very, very low. And if the only way to increase the amount of Palestinian autonomy is through a two-state solution, it seems like the amount of Palestinian autonomy will stay very low. How about let's start increasing Palestinian self-governance? Now, that means mainly three things, according to my read. The lived experience of Palestinian occupation has few elements, but the main ones, if I understand correctly, is the sense that there's no real freedom of movements, not within the Palestinian territories and not outside of the West Bank. By the way, everything I'm saying is specifically regarding the West Bank. Gaza is a different story. That's one. Two, Palestinians can do building and zoning because the amount of Area A and Area B is very limited. If this is too professional language, so later on you can ask me questions about this. And three, Palestinian economy is not independent. It's actually dependent on Israel ever since Oslo and the Paris Protocol. And all those three issues can be changed, hopefully we could start changing them tomorrow morning, independent on the end game, independent on a solution, independent on a peace treaty. Now here's my main argument is the following. If to do things on the ground, to connect the Palestinian autonomous islands to each other, to connect them to the world, to expand Area A and B, to liberate the economy, if these steps depend on ending the conflict, well, I'm afraid these steps will not be taken. I think we should start thinking about this, and that's why the myth of peace, of ending the conflict, is freeing the status quo. You see, there's two myths, not one, that is freeing the status quo. One is sacred settlements, and two is sacred peace. And the fact that if any step on the ground depends on peace, well, it seems like that peace is not coming, means no real steps on the ground. What I'm actually saying is, let's just reverse the order of things. Instead of having a vision we agree on in order to act on the ground, let's start acting on the ground and then think about the vision we agree on. And this is how this would work out. Once we really start increasing Palestinian self-governance, taking the Palestinian autonomy, dramatically increasing its power of self-governance to a level that starts enjoying what's someone called critical mass of self-governance. Once that autonomy is real, well, here you have a building block that fits into multiple endgames. For example, in the late 80s, there was an idea by Shimon Peres and King Hussein of a confederation of Jordan and Palestine. Is that a good idea? I don't know. I just know that if serious Palestinian autonomy could fit into that endgame. Yossi Beatty and others are speaking today about a Israeli-Palestinian confederation. Does this building block fit into that? Yes, it does. It also fits in, by the way, into the classic two-state solution. And it also could fit into other endgames. Julie, your endgame is something I can't think about right now because it's very new to me. But the classic endgames it fits into. So instead of if we have to agree on the endgame to play the game, it doesn't seem like we're agreeing on the endgame. There's no game to play. So instead of agreeing on the vision to start promoting actions, let's already tomorrow morning promote actions, create an entity that could fit into multiple endgames. And by the way, and I think once this entity exists, a real Palestinian autonomy, not as a part of ending the conflict, we just build this autonomy just because it's the right thing to do, then I think our political imagination will grow. Right now, managing the conflict means every day that passes, we have less options. Once we start working on the ground to increase Palestinian self-governance, every day that passes, there are more options. So in other words, instead of agreeing on the vision in order to promote actions, let's promote actions with not agreeing on the vision, assuming that actions on the ground will create an entity which will liberate our minds and open up many options and many visions that will promote a desirable end game.
Thank you, Micah, for laying out your vision of shrinking the conflict, which raises questions, which I hope we'll get to. We'll turn now, however, to hear from Hussein.
Oh, thanks very much, David. Great to be with everybody. All right, so we are at a really dire impasse. And I think in order to kind of understand how deep the impasse is and where it comes from, we need to begin by acknowledging that we're dealing with two sets of collectivities of human beings, right? These are people, behaving the way people do. And that means, on the one hand, the Israelis, Jewish Israelis, being human beings, will not engage in enlightened self-interest. They will not, act as if they really understand in a long-term way what's in their interests. Instead, they'll be driven by much more immediate, selfish, narrow concerns, as human beings do. And on the other hand, for the Palestinians, they will ultimately not submit to subjugation without hope and without a process, especially for citizenship of some kind, which I'll come back to, and indefinitely. And they will rebel again, almost certainly violently, because they are humans, even though that, the Second Intifada shows that that's likely a disastrous course and could be much more disastrous next time than it was last time. Yet I think they will do that. I'm sure they will eventually, because that is what human beings do. All right. The essence of the impasse, right, is, in my view, very straightforward, with problems on both sides. The main thing is the asymmetry of power. And that means, on the one hand, there is no real pressure on Israeli society to make the kind of compromises that would allow for any kind of version of a meaningful two-state solution. Why would Israel compromise in this way? Again, enlightened self-interest. I simply don't think human beings behave that way unless there is a real leverage on them to do it, and there isn't, and therefore they will not and they do not do that. The momentum, to the contrary, is all towards annexation rather than anything else, rather than a reasonable agreement. The asymmetry of power makes this conflict, under current circumstances, irresolvable without the intervention of an external force or some kind of great disruptive event that changes everybody's calculations. But for now, I just don't see how the Israelis are going to budge on the core issues that would allow Palestinians to make an agreement and gain meaningful autonomy, meaningful independence and citizenship. On the other hand, there are two dysfunctional parties. The Palestinians are divided, right? The Abraham Accords reveal that they have no national strategy, because for the last 10 years or so, if you ask leading Palestinians in the PLO, leading policymakers, what's your national strategy? They would either say the Arab Peace Initiative, or they would describe the Arab Peace Initiative without using the phrase. And of course, it's crazy to put your national strategy in the hands and control of other people with interests, because they could do exactly what the UAE did do last summer, which is redefine the whole thing in a way that suits them but doesn't suit you. So the idea that the Palestinians would be relying on a unified Arab bloc to incentivize Israel to come to terms with the PLO was always kind of a fiction, and now it's exposed as a completely unworkable idea and a dead letter. And the fact that they have no national strategy anymore and don't have any, aren't showing any development towards building one, is precisely because they have no national leadership, right? In the West Bank, you have the mayor of Ramallah, who thinks that he's the Palestinian president, really believes he's the Palestinian president, but he doesn't act like it. When Egypt kept trying to get him to go back into Gaza and take over the crossings and the ministries, he wouldn't do it because he was worried about the dangers, which were real, that he would end up with responsibility he couldn't pay for the people of Gaza, that he would have a Hezbollah-like situation with Hamas having arms but no responsibility, which is true, and that he'd have to let Hamas back into Nablus and places like that where they could cause all kinds of mischief in the West Bank. All of that was true, right? It was risky, but a national leader would take those risks in order to reassert his national leadership, but he wouldn't do it because he thinks and acts practically like the mayor of Ramallah. And in Gaza, you have Hamas, which is not fit to be an interlocutor on the global stage. It's not fit to be a national leadership, and it can't and won't be, as long as it continues to be, keep the policies, especially the violent policies and the Islamist policies that it has. So no national leadership explains why there's no national strategy. In my view, we are headed for a huge blowup in the West Bank. We are headed for an explosion of violence, whether it looks more, as I think it probably would, like the first Intifada or the second militarized Intifada, or some kind of hideous mashup of the two, which seems really plausible. This is going to happen. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, unless the equation is strongly rejiggered, right? And I actually think if you extrapolate from the current circumstances, the most logical scenario that arises out of the asymmetry of power is that in the context of this explosion of violence, Israel may well choose to impose new borders, new permanent borders, involving not merely the creation of new borders, but another round, a third round of mass expulsion of Palestinians from certain areas. I find this entirely logical, right? Now, what can we do to forestall this blow-up and this disastrous scenario that I'm imagining? Well, the first thing we can do is exactly what Micah has been suggesting. He's absolutely on the money in terms of, practically speaking, what could be done without disrupting any structures that exist on either side. Everything he said makes perfect sense, except the branding is problematic because you can't shrink the conflict. You don't, this is maybe delusional. It doesn't change the conflict. It doesn't shrink the conflict. It is a better version of conflict management than Netanyahu's version. It's not fundamentally different. It's still conflict management, but it's very smart. And it's exactly what can and should be done. And he's absolutely right about setting up the PA to become something else, an independent government, part of a confederation, whatever it is, that is viable, that is a kind of version of a two-state solution. That's absolutely true. But let me just say that though all of what he describes and more could strengthen the PA and turn it into something more like a government, and that could and should be done, I would caution that it's not a panacea involving forestalling a rebellion. Because actually, human history suggests that an empowered Palestinian public might be more willing to rebel than it is now. Frankly, it just doesn't. I wish human beings were more logical than they are, but they're not. They can become more empowered, and then that makes them more unruly than when they are on their backs. And that we've seen that before. So, with that caveat, I think Micah's ideas are great. The branding could delude people, but that doesn't really matter. He's on the money. The second thing is we need to, all of us, stop making matters worse, right? I wish we could rely on Hamas to be part of this, but unfortunately their stopping trade is making matters worse. But at least the Palestinians in the West Bank can stop with incitement and stop with arousing people, which would be good. Israel really must refrain from equation-changing new settlements, right? There's a couple on the table, and it is disastrous for them to go forward, obviously. At the same time, as part of the work on the ground that we've been talking about, there needs to be serious work, not just in strengthening the PA, but reconstructing Palestinian civil society, as well as governance, and paying attention to people work. All of that can be done under current circumstances, especially if you made aid, to the PA or to PA-related things dependent on, respecting civil society, which still exists in the West Bank. It's very weakened, In Gaza, it almost doesn't exist. There's business, but not really civil society. The third thing is that Israel should do something it has never done. And I don't imagine this or any other plausible Israeli government doing this. It's just a rhetorical thing, right? I mean, I think Micah said it was hard to imagine, the recognition of Israel. Well, that happened in 1993. The navel, the originary point of all Israeli-Palestinian diplomacy is the 1993 letters of mutual recognition. The first gambit is a letter from Arafat as chairman of the PLO to Prime Minister Rabin, recognizing the state of Israel and its right to live in freedom from threats and terrorism and all that. That is an official statement from the PLO, which has never been rescinded. Now, the question of Israel's Jewish character is something that's come up, especially after the Annapolis meeting. But in point of fact, the diplomatic representative of the Palestinians has recognized the state of Israel since 1993. What Israel has not, and they've never rescinded it. What Israel has never done is commit formally in writing in a really clear way, not implicitly, but in a clear way, the Palestinian right to a state. Right? Not necessarily recognize a Palestinian state. There are dozens of declarations of independence. No, I'm just saying the Palestinian right to a state has never been acknowledged by Israel in a formal, binding way. And because Rabin's response to Arafat was to recognize the PLO as an interlocutor and undertake negotiations with them. I think that recognition could be a game changer. I really do. Right? If it were coupled also with some of the other stuff we're talking about and not building some of these key settlements, the power of that would be enormous, right? But we haven't seen it. I don't expect it. Finally, I think ultimately, we do have to go back to a two-state solution. It could be either Westphalian or some kind of confederation. It could, the Jordanian thing, I think the Jordanians would be willing to join a loose Israeli-Palestinian Benelux kind of confederation, but only if the Israelis and Palestinians did it first, because they're very paranoid about being sort of canceled because of the number of Palestinian refugees. There is this terrible fear of annexation in Jordan. And I think the big winner in the Abraham Accord, other than the three parties, the UAE, Israel, and the US, was Jordan, because they were terrified of the idea of annexation and the importation of Palestinian nationalism out of the West Bank and Palestine into Jordan. And since Black September in 1970, the kind of unspoken agreement between Israelis and between Palestinians and Jordanians is you can have full citizenship, but don't pursue your national projects here. Do it in the West, do it in Palestine. And that's been pretty well adhered to. But of course, if you can't pursue your self-determination in one place, you'll pursue it somewhere else. So that brings me to my final comment, which is that I think that the key here is citizenship. The key here is the fact that you have 5 million people in the West Bank, Gaza, and lots of East Jerusalem without citizenship. That's the real anomaly in a world of states and citizens. Whether they're repressive states and monarchies, dictatorships, you still have states and citizens. These Palestinians under occupation are a complete anomaly. They're outside the whale. They don't even have theoretical rights that you may have in theory in, say, China, but you can't exercise them. But in theory, you have them. Right? They don't have them in theory. They don't have access to a government. They don't have participation in a state. This is extremely unusual, to say the least. And I think that the old grievances that arise from 48 and 67 and refugees and holy places, they are important, but the core that must be resolved is first-class citizenship and self-determination for the Palestinians. That's the lived reality that needs to be addressed, right? So that ultimately can be done in several different ways. But I think, honestly, until there is a real formula for getting there and the real prospect of getting there, the danger of these people who live outside the global whale to rebel against that and do it violently when the new generation forgets how badly it went last time, or they just don't care anymore because of some kind of an existentialist cri de coeur that human beings are given to, there's a very, very dangerous situation that could erupt not probably in the immediate future, but at some time I can't predict. And I fear also what the Israeli right might try to do to solve the problem through force under the rubric of dealing with a crisis, an unmanageable situation, and just doing, hey, what needs to be done in a condition of international anarchy where very few rules apply and where many people think Russia is about to not just annex Crimea, but invade Ukraine again, and states are grabbing what they can, and there's no the rule book is out. I wouldn't have believed the ethnic cleansing and border imposition scenario was plausible 10 years ago. But a lot has changed for the worse internationally right now. And it is an anarchic, relatively anarchic situation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. And now it's my pleasure to turn to our final opening panelist, Areej.
Thank you, David, for the invitation. I increasingly find it crucial for scholars to tether their findings to the political stakes of the subject with whom they engage and study closely. So I'm happy to be here today to attempt just that. I'll start by defining the situation. Let us start with where we are today, with what the organizer labeled as an impasse. What does this look like? From my end, as a political sociologist, we may identify, among others, the following processes. One, the entrenchment of social hierarchies that organize access to rights, privileges, and indeed even to life and death. I shall note the nation-state law as but one exemplary symbolic form. Second, predation and violences by a settler colonial state apparatus and by rapturous individual settlers, which entail spatial encroachment, disposition, ghettoization, and what would Wakant may call the production of advanced marginality. Under a singular, though fragmented state apparatus, concatenated geographies are ruled over by Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and refugees. Some like to say that it's the Israeli state that acts out of peace. In fact, it is the entrenchment of material politico-symbolic disposition that constitutes Israeli state rule and existence. Third, unattainable and paradoxical economic practices, that is, colonization by other means, including widening satisfaction and state earmarking efforts that operate through a revised neoliberal rationality. Fourth, on the international stage, the Trump plan lent legitimacy to the continuation of colonization, appropriation, further disposition, and the annexation of the eastern part of Jerusalem. Fifth, on the regional level, we have the failure of the Arab Spring and the new forms of state interactions between Israel and authoritarian Arab governments. Last is the context for mobilization. Of course, we are in the wake of May 2021, when new forms of mobilization among Palestinians in Jerusalem and Palestinian in Israel occurred. Forms of resistance, refusal, co-production, and other relations of dissent, collaboration, and negotiation take place every day for Palestinians. In the West Bank, I will note a significant hurdle to political mobilization has been the class of economic and political beneficiaries, the PA and its allies, those whose daily life is rendered relatively stable by occupation, while the majority of the Palestinians live under enduring colonial occupation that operates through the rule of emergency and devastates their mere existence. In all, while it feels in the political realm that we remain in a state of impasse, let us not take this to mean status. In my own work, as I think about the utility of settler colonialism as an analytical framework to explain the reality and history of social and political life in Israel-Palestine, I attend deeply to the dynamism of daily life, to contingency, and then to institutionalization of practices that either further constrain or open up paths for transformation. As to solutions, Rightly so. I think there is a great hesitation over the popularization of terminology of decolonization to express the desired future of Israel-Palestine. In some usages, the term is empty. Let me try to express what I mean by decolonization. First, my usage of the term as prognostic category responds to the diagnosis analytical category of settler colonialism, which describes a fundamental set of asymmetrical relations between coloniality and indigeneity. Settler colonialism entails the replacement of one community by other, regardless of claim to territorial belonging. We can look at Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinian neighborhood in Jerusalem, as but the latest manifestation of such process. Decolonization for me is macro mechanism constituted by micro and meso-level mechanisms. Roughly speaking, we can talk of political decolonization and of material decolonization. While I envision decolonization as necessitating the two, in practice they are separable. Drawing on both the history and present of South Africans, we know of the symbolic significance of decolonization, which is crucial for political liberation. And yet, it's essential to be alerted to the precarious conditions of the majority of South Africans today. Domination has not disappeared. Intercommunal violence remains dangerously high. For instance, as does extreme stratisfaction, often along pre-existing racialized cleavages. Thinking about the economic conditions, the bulk of the South African lives today look similar materially to their parents' and grandparents' lives decades before. Here is political decolonization without economic decolonization or just redress. Attending comparatively to solution to settler colonization urges us to think about the challenges and constraints of a decolonization that transforms lived realities. Despite importance of the political decolonization, without economic decolonization and the just redistribution of resources and reconfiguration of social property relations, transformation is unlikely. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what we might call the ideal type future might be less important. A democratic state for all of its citizens, a federal state, a binational state, one state, and etc. What is more significant is the different configurations suggested as solution be disaggregated on the ground into practical relations. Forms of material and symbolic violence will be halted. Redress is instituted. Palestinian trauma recognized and allowed to heal. The system in which life chances are determined according to hierarchies of social kind, which is the prioritization of a Jewish-Israeli privilege, is dismantled. Optimally, such configuration is one without partition or renewed separation. We might call this one state that protects collective and individual rights for the two national groups, Palestinian and Israeli Jews and others. Additionally, it's one where political and material decolonizations are coupled. Decolonization is also regional and global. The violences of the Arab states in their treatment of the Palestinian questions and of course of their people has gone unresolved. Palestinians remain in a state of marginality in Arab states, which requires attention for any solution to Israel-Palestine in case Palestinians choose not to return. The Zionist movement, by trying to create an answer to the Jewish question through political territorial sovereignty in Palestine, transformed some Israeli Jews into colonial perpetrators, others into implicated subjects, a term I borrow from Michael Rothberg, in maintaining or benefiting from uneven and violent social relations, and others into Jewish victims of Zionism. While we know that the victim-perpetrator binary delimits our analytical grasp of the complexity of structural position, we shouldn't shy away from the discussion how agency is enacted given context and contingency, which is to say, why and how perpetration of violence emerges. In thinking up solution, we must then consider how structural position can be modified. Finally, I want to refer to the phenomenology of relations of Palestinian citizens in Israel that might constitute a strong component in efforts for decolonization. In the last 2 decades, especially Palestinian citizens of Israel have taken articulating both an analytical scholarly approach to settler colonialism in Palestine and also a political approach to decolonization. These are social actors who, by the nature of their being in this place, hold a phenomenological proximity to Jewish Israeli. They speak Hebrew, many live in so-called mixed cities, they may interact daily with Israeli Jews, they study together in the universities, but they also experience social closure or exclusion. Many are subject to spatial separation and abandonment, and others to disposition, like the Bedouin in the Naqab. They encounter symbolic and material violences daily, and they are steeped in what I like to think of as a habit of sumud, wherein they have learned and keep learning how to live in such a reality and to struggle against injustices. They are deeply shaped by historical events, the intifadas and the asymmetrical wars, for instance. Importantly, the encounter between Palestinian in Israel and Jewish Israeli is markedly different from that between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians in the 1967 occupied Palestinian territories. So, in thinking about how we can theorize out of impasse, we must consider all these features of the violences of everyday life Palestinians encounter in the Jewish state, but also of a future of liberation that they are trying to imagine and enact. We can look, for example, to the Haifa Declaration from Mad al-Karmel, which began this attempt. The authors, Palestinian citizens of Israel, wrote, quote, "We present our vision for achieving a dignified life in our homeland and building a democratic society founded upon justice, freedom, equality, and mutual respect between the Palestinians and Arab Jews in Israel. We also put forward our conception of the preconditions for a historic reconciliation between the Palestinian people and the Israeli Jewish people, and of the future to which we aspire as regards the relationship between the two peoples. This project, along with other future visions documents like it, including the State of All Its Citizens movement by the National Democratic Assembly in late 90s, display precisely how Palestinian citizens' phenomenological positions prompted a different type of theorizing, one that confidently proposes a future of decolonized cohabitation that includes Jewish Israelis. I encourage everyone to Google the Haifa Declaration and see for yourself the types of imagining Palestinian citizens have made. Despite Palestinian citizens having seriously thought through potential for an alternative future based on democratic equality, they unfortunately have been met with little acceptance. I believe, however, that they are crucial to envisioning and enacting a different future, and we should listen to them because of their liminal position that proposes a model of relations and sociality predicated on the disposal of Jewish-Israeli colonial privileges and the envisioning of a just future for all, especially as we are in a political moment wherein we have reached a point where the two-state solution is not only less and less visible, but it's also less desirable among Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Areej. I think we can now perhaps bring everybody into the picture as we open up for a conversation. And Areej, I would like to stay with you and ask, as you think about this project of decolonization that you regard as the essential next step in imagining a better future, I wonder, and you mentioned the Haifa Declaration, which you encourage people to look at and is available online. I wonder what you make of the political participation at present of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and particularly the Joint Arab List, which, amongst other things, includes Jewish members of some of the parties within it. Is that part of the political praxis that you see as essential toward moving in the direction of decolonization, or is it, in some sense, participating in the perpetuation of the project of colonization?
Thank you, David. You're asking me about the joint list or the
joint list in specific, but more generally, Palestinian participation in existing Israeli political institutions like the Knesset, dominated by Israeli Jewish parties and actors.
I think, unfortunately, one of the possibilities that the Israeli government has dismissed is the joining of the joint list to the government. And I actually didn't anticipate that they would be included, because the political project that they are proposing is a project of decolonizing Israel, decolonizing the Jewish state. But like the political situation and the practices of the joint list could have actually composed such a vision that could include all citizens, Palestinians and Israelis. And again, it was missed, not just because of the government, I think, and also it's because of the dynamics within the joint list, that it wasn't clear about this vision. If, for example, it has adopted this vision of a state of all of its citizens, not partition, a vision that could propose a Palestinian and Israeli future that would include all Palestinian, not just Palestinian and Israel, it might have might open the path for decolonization.
Thank you. One of the common threads, it seems to me, of all of your visions is that they defer or hold off sort of grand solutions. They all sort of begin with bottom-up movements of change. And two of you at least seem to be in substantial agreement about the sort of the category of shrinking the conflict. And I want to begin to sort of drill down a little bit more deeply in that. Ask you initially, Micah, as a philosopher, putting aside the hat you wear as best-selling author and a close governmental advisor for which the rest of us academics look on with admiration and no small measure of envy, it must be stated. Where is the pursuit of justice in your, where's justice in your vision? There's a tremendous asymmetry, power asymmetry between Israel and the Palestinians. Jews have achieved, in the form of the Zionist movement, their aspirations for self-determination. Palestinians have not. Just wondering where in your mind you file away sort of that larger category of justice or the common good in the name of sort of a practical, bottom-up, piecemeal solution, or is that a false dichotomy too?
It's the other way around, David. It's about, there's a lot of injustice now, tremendous amount of injustice, tremendous amount of asymmetry. Here's my question. If we can't completely erase the asymmetry tomorrow morning, does that mean we keep things the way they are? No, we start shrinking the asymmetry in power. Now, right now, it seems like one of the reasons, there's many reasons, negotiations doesn't seem possible, is because the Palestinian political entity, which Hussein calls Abbas the mayor of Ramallah. That's new to me. So this very weak political entity can't really enter negotiations with Israel for many reasons. One, because of that asymmetry in power. Let's start shrinking the asymmetry in power. Let's start empowering the Palestinian Authority. Let's start increasing Palestinian self-governance. And maybe that could lead, I don't know to what. And I'm agnostic here for a good reason. If we have to agree on the end game, we'll be paralyzed and frozen because we can't agree on the end game now. So let's not agree on the end of the journey. Let's just agree on start walking, marching on this journey. Instead of agreeing on narratives, on stories, on our dreams, let's only agree on actions on the ground.
Okay, and Hussein, you embraced this general idea, but with
I
some
embraced the measures.
With some caveats. You said you have to rebrand the idea. You said that. There's an imminent explosion, and we have to agitate towards universal citizenship. And it seems like those three pieces do not sit easily together. So I'm wondering if you could maybe.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm super pessimistic. All right. I am very. If you ask me right now to, draw out logical conclusions from where we are, given the way human beings tend to think and act, I think we're going in a very, very, very dangerous direction. And changing that is going to be very hard. I think the kinds of things Micah is thinking about are doable if the parties are willing to cooperate, particularly if the Israeli government is willing to take those risks and do that stuff. I think it would have the effect of strengthening the PA, and you could structure it with the international community, especially donors, to strengthen Palestinian civil society, and you might open a window to other possibilities. As I said, you might also bring forward in a counterintuitive way the reckoning, because again, I'm thinking about human conduct rather than enlightened self-interest. People don't do that. I mean, and I say the Israelis are not going to behave with enlightened self-interest. I don't think I'm insulting them. Palestinians didn't behave with enlightened self-interest over partition in the 1940s. People don't do that. They don't extrapolate 40 years and no, they say, what do we have now and why should we give it up? And what are you asking of me? That's how they think. So when I talk about universal citizenship, I'm saying really not necessarily that everybody needs to share anything. I'm just saying that when you have 5 million people who don't have that basic status in this world, and everything that necessarily flows from that reality, right? The disempowerment of non-citizenship in our world, the structural disempowerment, it virtually guarantees an explosion. I don't know that it's imminent, but clearly that's where we're going. The best way forward is to do the kinds of things that Micah is talking about, because they can be done and other things can't be done. And because they have a good chance of making things better and opening up possibilities. As I said, I have questions with the branding, just because I think it can delude some Israelis into thinking they're actually changing the basic equation when they're not. It's a quibble. I like the measure, so what difference does it make what the box is, right? The blender is the same blender, that's fine. The other thing is it doesn't indemnify us from a sudden reckoning that is very, very dangerous. So, at the moment, though, I really do think that's all we can do, because there is no deus ex machina, there is no outside force, the hegemonic force that's going to knock heads together, no Ottoman Empire, nothing like that. We're stuck in this situation. So I actually think, along with some of the things I suggested, that's the way to go forward. And I do think they don't sit well together. But to tell you the truth, this is fighting against the logic of the structure that exists. And that's all you can do. I'm not confident at all. I'm not optimistic at all. In fact, I'm really scared.
Okay, thank you. Let's turn our attention to Julie, who laid out her very interesting theoretical model of autonomism. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Julie, about how autonomism fits into this model of shrinking the conflict. At one level, one could imagine autonomism as encouraging or allowing for the possibility of sort of a compartmentalization in the form of cantons, which is sort of enshrining what exists on the ground already into sort of autonomous pockets of different kinds of community. Is autonomism inclined to that kind of sort of piecemeal, localized vision? And how does autonomism relate to the quest for universal citizenship that Hussein also outlined during his time?
Yeah, so thank you. So I hope, I tried to make clear at the end of my remarks that autonomism, at least the autonomism that I'm advocating, is committed to universal citizenship, albeit a differentiated model or a layered model of universal citizenship. But that's where I see a difference between the autonomism that I'm taking out of Dubnov and trying to develop as a contemporary alternative, and the autonomism advocated by the Israeli right from Begin onwards. And I do see Micah's vision of shrinking the conflict as part of that tradition, precisely because that tradition of autonomism on the right does offer autonomy to Palestinians basically as a consolation prize. We won't give Palestinians a state. We won't give Palestinians sovereignty. We won't give Palestinians full citizenship, but we will give them autonomy in the form of limited political rights and greater economic opportunities. I do not support that approach, both for pragmatic but also for normative reasons, right? So I'm advocating autonomism of the Dubnovian kind precisely because I believe that it will allow us to envision a regime that simultaneously allows for the aspirations to national self-determination of Jews and Palestinians, but does so in an egalitarian way that doesn't privilege Jewish nationalism over that of Palestinian nationalism. And we could talk about different ways in which that that dual aspiration could be realized. But I do want to stress the very important difference between the autonomism of the right that, as I said, offers Palestinians autonomism as a consolation prize when it refuses them sovereignty and or citizenship versus the kind of autonomism that I'm advocating, which is basically a unpacking and devolution of a regime which now restricts sovereignty to Jews alone. And I'm advocating a devolution of power so that Jews and Palestinians, everyone living in the region, has equal citizenship, but the citizenship is organized in such a way that still leaves room for collective national expression and collective desires for self-determination. And I just wanted to add one note with respect to Areej's comments, that I do think that one of the hardest things for the kind of democratic egalitarian autonomism that I'm advocating is the huge economic disparities between Israeli Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the West Bank, because with those economic disparities, even if there is formal equality of some kind at the level of citizenship, I think we're still at risk of the kind of cantonization, David, that you just mentioned, precisely because it's just very hard to imagine how to bridge those economic disparities in a way that would make that formal citizenship substantively equal. So I just want to acknowledge that really important point that Areej made about not working just on the political level, but also on the economic level.
Extremely important point. I want to follow up on this and will in just a minute, but Micah would like to jump in with a quick response.
So Julie located shrinking the conflict, and I understand why, as a part of the Begin Likud tradition on the right. Just want to make a very important distinction, Julie. It's true, I agree with you. What the right always says is autonomy is instead of a state. It's a reconciliation prize. It's instead of, that's the end game. Shrinking the conflict is different. It's not autonomy as an end game instead of the two-state solution. It's increasing autonomy in order to open us up to multiple end games, including a two-state solution. That's where I differ from the Begin tradition. Just want to make that clear.
Okay. But go ahead, Julie.
My question is, but do you have a principled commitment to an end game? That's what I don't understand, right? If there's a principled commitment of some kind to an end game that includes citizenship for everyone.
I'm against the principled end game for the following reason. If we have to agree on the end game, that freezes the status quo. Right-wingers, left-wingers, and centrists in Israel can't work together if the condition for working together is agreeing on the end game. That's why I'm for agreeing on actions, not on narratives, not on end games.
All right, Micah, I want to get back to Julie's question, but as long as we have you here. So what stands in the way? This is a question that came up in the Q&A. What actually stands in the way of your shrinking the conflict model? What practically on the ground in terms of political actions and sensibilities prevents the Israeli government from beginning, as you say, tomorrow to enhance autonomy?
Politically speaking, exactly what me and Julie were just talking about. Many Israelis are, for very good reasons, very much afraid of a process that would lead to, right now, in this Middle East, to a creation of a chaotic fundamental Palestinian state. The fears that the chaos of the Middle East will enter the West Bank and will spill into Tel Aviv. So they always say, once we start this, it's a slippery slope, we'll have an independent Palestinian state. It's ironically only if Israelis believe this is not a part of a large, charismatic, inspiring endgame. Only if they believe that, they'll start playing this game. That's on the public opinion level, on the level of this government. So maybe, and this is just a theory I have. I mean, when I speak, people think I speak for the government. I really, really don't, David. I really, really don't. I think when we speak about the Abraham Accords, so till now, the Abraham Accords were more or less a way through ignoring the Palestinians. I think the next creative step will be, how do we maneuver the Abraham Accords towards the Palestinians? Maybe the next state, the next country that will join the Abraham Accords will say something like, we're joining in increasing levels of normalization with Israel if Israel increases level of sovereignty for Palestinians. Maybe that's the way to do this.
You see that happening, Hussein?
Yes, I mean, I think the big enchilada is Saudi Arabia, and I don't think Saudi Arabia is ready to do this yet. I think they're keeping their options open. They're very interested in it, but I think the cost is very different for Saudi Arabia than it was for the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco. They have a whole lot of concerns, internal and external, that don't apply. So also, in order, and a really complicated political situation inside Saudi Arabia, I do think if they did this under current circumstances, they would need something pretty significant regarding the Palestinians to make it worth their while. For the UAE, this made so much sense. They have 12 or 13, ideas about why this is good. And for Bahrain, partnering up with the country that's doing the heavy lifting against Iran's militia allies is kind of a no-brainer. But for Saudi Arabia, it's a very fraught question. And I do think they would have a big ask. And so, yeah, it's entirely possible if they ever do decide to do that.
Okay. Julie and Areej, I want to return to you and ask the following question. What incentive, or perhaps better, how would one incentivize Israeli Jews who are possessed of serious political power, in Julie's case, to step down from the Olympian heights of Westphalian sovereignty to embrace this principle of autonomism? Or in Areej's case, to begin a process of decolonization that, as you note, doesn't include only political colonization, but material economic as well. When one questioner asks, can you give us examples of successful or unsuccessful cases of autonomism, which really points to the larger question, how does one imagine sort of moving from sovereignty to autonomism and surrendering? It's really about the surrender of power. So, Julie, let's begin with you.
That, of course, is the million-dollar question that I do not purport to have an answer to, in the sense that I do think that, again, the key is mass political mobilization, and maybe this is my American side coming through, that I believe in social movements, and I think that the problem now is that there is no social movement, but I don't know how to generate such a social movement, and obviously. An autonomous solution involves huge costs and trade-offs. Any solution involves huge costs and trade-offs. And I think that's why we have moved away from a discussion of solutions, because all of them involve extremely painful concessions and compromises that no one is willing to make. But I guess having punted in that way on what is the key question, I guess I would say that what I'm trying to argue for, again, is not necessarily a particular map or blueprint, but a change in the political language that we speak. And my hope is that in changing the political language and giving us different theoretical vocabularies in which to try to articulate and coordinate our aspirations, twin aspirations to self-determination and to equal citizenship, we might be able to forge new coalitions. And that's the sense in which I think it's more important to play the long game rather than commit to a specific blueprint or proposal right now, because I do think, and this is bringing Areej's discussion of the Haifa Declaration back into the conversation, I really do think it's only through the long, hard work of building grassroots coalitions on the ground between Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel that the political dynamics and calculus and language is going to change in ways that open up unforeseen possibilities for mobilization on the level of the conflict writ large.
Thank you. Areej, you operate in, one of the worlds you operate in is a world dominated by Israeli Jewish institutions and actors, including the university at which you teach. And I'm just wondering, you sort of have, in a certain sense, an opportunity to think of a local process of decolonization. What would that look like? And could you imagine Israeli Jews really surrendering the kind of power that they have in order to achieve that state of decolonization that you speak of? What would it take?
Thank you, David, for the question. I think let's start by proposing that we are not like the 0 point, that we didn't propose that. I think Palestinian has proposed options for kind of shared livability without Jewish supremacy, and they failed on that. They failed because of the Jewish supremacist feeling of that this homeland is theirs and the Palestinians are strangers. Having said that, I think we should draw in this stage to think about the Palestinian and Jewish diaspora, of course, together with the local mobilization in Israel-Palestine. And I agree with Julia, and I think this kind of mobilization on the ground in Israel is happening. Last May was one of the examples of political protest that, again, was suppressed by Israel. What I mean by Jewish and Palestinian diaspora, I think first, that the Jewish diaspora has a very crucial role to end the situation of colonialism and Jewish supremacy in Palestine. And they have historically proposed political projects that are not merely in line with Zionism, which is not just a Jewish state. I think there is a transformation in the Jewish Jewry today in the world and of the perception of the Israeli state. They should play a major role in getting us out of the impasse. And I think in this regard also, Palestinians should think to flip the question from the Palestinian rights and ending the occupation and the discrimination inside Israel to propose the Jewish rights. In case the Palestinians manage to turn to the question of Jewish rights in Palestine, to give this safety place of Jews that they can live in Palestine, in Israel, without being supremacist. Because as I mentioned in my talk, the way the Israeli life in Israel are managed through force and power. When Israel loses this force and power, the Jewish existence in Palestine is threatened. So the thinking of the Palestinian thinking of Jewish rights and enabling this idea of one state that includes all that have and promising rights for all, I think this is the political moment which Palestinians collaborating with international forces and with Jewish diaspora should think of a different future that guarantee the Israelis a different form of being as not supremacists.
Interesting. An interesting transposition of focus on not Palestinian but Jewish rights as part of that reimagined world. Okay, I think we have time for one more question and just a set of quick responses. It comes from one of our questioners, and it asks about settlers and the settler movement, which we haven't talked about at all, especially at a time when there's increasing violence from settlers directed at Palestinians and perhaps less commitment and allegiance to the Israeli state, more of a sense of sort of independent settler presence. And just in numerical terms, the settlers are an extremely important demographic and political force. So I'm wondering, maybe Micah, we'll begin with you very briefly. Where do settlers fit into your vision of shrinking the conflict? And in some sense, you yourself happen to be one. According to the classic definition, you are one.
Yes, I think you're going to be seeing this government taking more severe measures in order to protect Palestinians from violent and settlers. I think this is going to be a part of the policy of the Defense Minister Gantz. And this shrinking the conflict, I think this has nothing to do with shrinking the conflict. This is just the right thing to do. This is not a part of shrinking the conflict, increasing Palestinian self-governance. Not a part of that. It's just the right thing to do, and I hope this government will be doing that.
Okay, Hussein, settlers in this equation.
Yeah. So my fundamental starting point here has been that people, groups of people, collectivities of people, do not behave rationally, and I keep coming back to that again and again and again. And we should not expect them to behave rationally. The way they behave is unpredictable. But then there are constituencies within those collectivities that represent the most irrational elements of the collectivity's impulses. And I think many of the settlers, including the violent ones, the more extreme ones, the ideological settlements in Hebron, which the other day was graced by the president of the Republic, lighting, I think it was the second menorah candle of Hanukkah in the ugliest settlement in the whole of Palestine, which is kind of remarkable. That in the end, the settlers are a very, they kind of, as I say, they represent that maximalism on the Israeli side. There are many similar constituencies on the Palestinian side, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, things like that. And again, you have this kind. But what I'm getting at here is that it can be, you can get people, even these irrational collectivities, to respond to incentives and disincentives, to discipline and curtail the maximum irrationality, right? People will respond to inducements and disincentives. They do that. And, the problem is here, we have one side that has no leverage at all, and the other side that has no incentive, particularly, to do anything meaningful. I think Micah can make the case to other Israelis that it would make sense to do these so-called shrinking things, especially if they buy the false idea that it would shrink anything. But he could sell them on the management plan that he's proposing because it will make the situation calmer and easier. But it doesn't actually change.
And I'm going to have to interrupt because we just have about 2 minutes, and I want to hear from you. Okay, great. Areej, I'm just curious. Settlers, we just spoke about Jewish rights. Where might they fit into the picture?
Yeah, David, I think proposing the question as focusing on the settlers without looking at the state apparatus that enabled this project would be problematic. The settlers are not motivated by ideological steps. We learn very clearly that most of the settlers now in the Palestinian West Bank are motivated by economic incentives. These economic incentives are proposed by the state, which is now in the beyond the green line, is proposed as the most welfare state in the world. These incentives, if we stop them, I think the diminishing of settlers who are looking for serenity, having a house in the occupied Palestinian territory to write, to envision a different future, this has to be stopped at the level of the apparatus of a colonial state, and not just imposing this on settlers, individuals, as they are the mere criminals. It is the state project that's settling these settlers.
Got it. And final word to Julie. Settlers and the vision of autonomism, as you understand.
I guess as a political vision that separates political membership and citizenship from territorial concentration, autonomism does have some affinities with approaches that, again, try to resolve the conflict without territorial partition. And resolving the conflict without territorial partition arguably means that settlers get to stay where they are. Maybe not 100% of all settlers get to stay where they are, but that you're trying to solve the conflict without mass evacuations precisely by detaching citizenship from the address of the street on which you live. And so I do think there is a value in that approach. And I know some groups have actually built coalitions with settlers who are attracted by this prospect. There are, questions about the ways in which that approach would, arguably validate and entrench unjust appropriations of various kinds. And I'm aware of that concern. I think it's a valid concern, but I also do think that for purposes of mobilization and coalition building, it may be an advantage of approaches that avoid territorial partition, that they do not require mass evacuations of a kind that arguably are not politically possible right now.
Great. Well, we have come to the end of our time. I want to very briefly thank our four panelists for a very rich discussion. And I'm just going to turn things over to Steve Ross for a final word.
Right. Thank you, David. Thank you, Julie, Micah, Hussein, Areej, for sharing your ideas. I just want to make one observation as an American historian who is fascinated by all this and looking in on it and learning. If there's one word that came out of our first session looking forward, it was confederation. What I find interesting is this session has taken a very different path because confederation is something towards an end game, or at least a near end game. And today I find very interesting the focus has been, if I would call it shrink the conflict, as Micah has said, which is in a sense, don't focus on an end game, don't even focus on a mid-range game, focus on immediate smaller steps. But to me, the question that we leave with, and there is no time for it, but we can think about it maybe for our third panel, which is the reason you want to focus on smaller steps and shrink the conflict, from my point of view, is something we haven't talked about, which is how do you create good faith on both sides? Without good faith, there is no movement forward. And I would say that the idea of these smaller steps, to my mind, are interesting if they're oriented towards creating a sense of good faith that, okay, I don't know what the answer is going to be, but at least maybe both sides can take a step together. That said, again, I want to thank everyone. I want to also thank David and Maya Ferdman at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and Dov Waxman at the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israeli Studies, and my associate director, Lisa Ansel, for her tireless work. And David, I give you the very last word for today.
Thank you all, and we look forward to it next time. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.